This presentation that I'm going to do is about sort of the tools, equipment and consumables that this hobby requires, I guess. Some of this a little bit sort of Daryl covered off in the beginning as far as sort of what are the sort of main components you might need, but this kind of dives down in a bit more detail of some of the little bits and pieces that you might forget that you might actually need, particularly for the newbies that are starting out. Yeah, you'll buy lights and power supplies and a controller, but do they all actually plug in together properly and so safely? What tools, what consumables might you sort of not have thought of to give you sort of a bit of an idea of how many trips up to Bunnings and on eBay that you might need to do for this hobby. Yeah? That's a lot of nodding. Yeah, you all get it, right? I've been in this hobby for sort of 5 or 6 years, seriously. I'm no means an expert, and I won't necessarily be covering absolutely everything, but it's just sort of thoughts and ideas that I've gathered over the past sort of couple of months that have been discussed in chat and on the forums, etc., of things that people sort of recommend. What you guys were sort of talking about earlier about keep a list of sort of links and things like that. It's invaluable. I think Dave Lithgow shares his infamous spreadsheet of all of his display, which is absolutely bonkers long because he's got a large display, but every single line is almost down to the pixel that he's got in his display, but he's got all the calculations of everything. I borrowed that from him a couple of years ago and sort of made it a bit smaller and tidier for my needs, but that file that I've got, which I keep on Dropbox so I can kind of access it wherever I need to, has got at least 20 tabs on it of links to lights in Ray's store, because we all know how good that is to shop and find things, links to tools and other bits and pieces on eBay and Bunnings, etc. So I might not have the money now, I might not need it now, but in a few months' time I might need to come around and do something like that, so at least I sort of got the reference there. So what are the main components? Lights, obviously, we've covered that off. You've got your strips, your string, floods, panels, AC lights, DC lights. You've got some power supplies. You'll have a controller or a few. You'll need some cables to join all these things together, unless you're going to go full wireless like some of us do. You'll need some gear for the actual show control and all the network to control it. And then at the end we'll sort of round off with a few miscellaneous tools and bits and pieces that don't necessarily fit into one of these categories. So for the lights, yeah, you can buy the lights of rolls of strip or whatever. They won't necessarily plug into anything straight off the shelf or straight off of eBay or straight off of Ray. You'll need some connectors, or commonly known as pigtails. But what size connectors? Well, they need to be waterproof. How many pins in said connector do you need? How long does the connector need to be? Do you need to consider in power injection as well? So, some examples. So top left, you've got probably one of the stock standard ones that comes with the lights if you don't ask Ray or whomever to put on connectors for you. That's the JST connectors. But if you're building a prop that is either inside or completely waterproof and sealed, they could still hold up fine. These are probably the more common connectors that are widely used. You've got a single insulated one here, so I'm not sure how clear it is, but you can kind of make out, you can actually see sort of the 3 wires going through in this one. This is pretty much exactly the same thing, but it's double insulated, so it kind of looks a bit more like a stock standard 240 volt extension lead. It's not necessarily the same gauge as one of those extension leads, but as far as what the wiring and the connections, I use on my roof outline is strip, and originally I got a way to put these connectors on them, because when a section finishes here and another one I want to start there, using these type of connectors to try and tuck them out of the way so that I can get those 2 strips to butt up nice and next to each other actually puts a lot of strain on the solder joint to that strip, and I've had to replace half of my roof line because this is the main point of failure for my roof strip. when I started getting replacement pieces of strip, I didn't ask for them, but they came with this single insulation type. And it's actually better in that instance because this is more flexible. I can tuck those leads around, they're not as chunky, and I can then zip tie them up again just to make sure they don't move. And I've had no issues of any of my roof strip that are using this type of connection now. It's not necessarily the more popular choice, maybe. I think I've seen most displays using this one, but yeah, it certainly has its applications in your own displays, definitely. This piece here is commonly known as a T-piece, so it's an injection piece. So most common configuration of this is 3 pins, male and female on the outside for your data and power to connect through. But in the middle is only 2 pins, and that'll be your positive and negative for power injection. I think some people might like to just connect a couple of connectors together, but if you're not so trustworthy with your soldering skills and things like that, that T-piece is an easy solution. When you're making elements, it's probably advised to make them data in and a data out, regardless of whether you are planning to put something on the end of it or not. Because chances are, in the future, you're going to expand your show and you might want to add more candy canes, or you might want to feed your candy canes into these new choreo stars that you decided to build. And as such, for maybe a season or so, you might have a data out that isn't necessarily going to be waterproof. So these caps here screw onto those type of connectors to help seal up and stop some of the weather and the elements getting in. Likewise with strip, these are the kind of connectors that can be put on if you do want to terminate. They're available with completely sealed, so you can just have a bit of silicone in them and chuck them on the end. Or if you're feeding wires out, there's 2, I think there's 3 and 4 hole configurations as well. For those that are using panels, so on the left you've got the power. So 9 times out of 10, if you're ordering panels from Ray, etc., they're the type of cables that you'll get to power 2 of them together. And then this will be the data connection, the ribbon cable, but it's only long enough to do this right, left to right connections. Panels feed sort of from left to right. That cable is only long enough to join those 2. If you wanted to stack your panels and make a matrix and go from the top panel down, those cables are not long enough. You will need to make your own necessarily. So you can go to JCar or, a reputable cable seller and buy X number of meters of ribbon cable. Some of these connectors, there is a specific crimping tool, or if you've got a vise, you could probably do it that way, and you can make up your own custom length. Particularly going from the controller for set panels to the individual panels, you'll definitely want to make your own ones too. Some of the lights, securing them to the house. Zip ties, as mentioned, are a godsend in this industry. The black ones are usually UV rated for the harsh Australian sun, but if you're doing that many of them, the recommendation is to get a zip tie gun. Otherwise your fingers are going to get pretty sore, and all that cutting will dull your knives and scissors, etc. Those zip ties might need to be attached to something, so zip tie mounts is something to consider. If you're using strip, a lot of the time you'll probably attach that to electrical conduit. So if you're buying electrical conduit, you need to cut it, you'll need a conduit cutter. How is the conduit going to affix to your roof or your wall, etc.? You might need some saddle clips to hold it as well. If you're putting things on your brickwork, you can get things like brick clips, or you can drill straight into the brickwork using the appropriate plugs and screws, etc. It's assumed everyone owns a drill and or drill bits, but I will point out a couple of specific drill bits that you might need, particularly for brickwork. Is a masonry type bit. They're not necessarily common in a stock standard drill piece kit. And a step drill is good for drilling out conduit if you're going to be putting individual pixels through it. Because that means it'll make the hole bigger on the back side, get it to the right size on the front. It means pushing in the pixel from the back. You've got plenty of clearance for the wires to come through out the back as well. So just to put some visuals on that. So the top left, you've got the zip tie gun. It's got an adjustable wheel on there to adjust how tight you can actually put the strength that it's gripping. You don't necessarily want to squeeze the life out of your lights and actually cut off the circulation and no data will get through. Brick clip next to it for hanging. That's a brick clip that I use for hanging my Kmart stars on my wall. Below those are a couple of different types of zip tie mounts. So these ones here are probably more common, I think I've seen. The sticky backing on the back of those is useless, so rip it off and probably silicone those to whatever it is that you're trying to attach things to. So I've got a bunch of those around my roof line on my tiles, and I zip tie my conduit to those to hold the roof line strip in place. And yeah, below that is an example of what that looks like. The red thing there is the conduit cutter. Saddle clips there, so if you're wanting to hold conduit or tubing around the house. And there's another clip there, an image I saw of Video Man's. I hadn't seen one of those before. I don't know if it's 3D printed or what. The Bunnings one? Yeah, right. But again, yet another option for, you know, mounting lights. I'll touch on power supplies, but I will do a bit of a disclaimer. We hold no responsibility to any damage to equipment, buildings or persons for electrical work that you do. Electrical work, particularly on the 240 side of things, should legally be carried out by a licensed electrician. It is dangerous, right? That said, when you buy a power supply, you literally just get a power supply. It still needs to be plugged into things. So you will need an input lead of some description, whether it's an IEC/kettle cord or it's a chopped up extension lead. These are examples I've seen used before. A topic that actually came up conveniently while I was putting this together during the week is crib terminals and how do you pronounce that? Ferrules? Ferrules. I've got a few of them living in Cranbourne. I'm one of them, admittedly, but for connecting the wires to power supplies, etc. And then for the safety aspect as well, a fuse board and the fuses that go in them. So we've got examples here of those things. So there's two power supplies there. The one on the left is a Meanwell's power supply, and the one in the middle is the stock standard Chinese version. So that's an IEC cable for those who haven't seen them before. Basically, it's just the same type of one that plugs into your kettle, really. We all know what an extension cord looks like, but if you're going to use an extension cord, maybe use a piggyback one, so you can, if you haven't got enough power sort of running through your yard, using piggyback obviously means that you can still sort of add on one or two things together. Obviously, not too much to load up your circuits, but you know, do it within reason. A bunch of the different types of ferrules, love that word now, ferrules there, and the applicators for them, and there's some examples of these ones that will be sort of those, the blue one, that'll be the fork one. I think there's a bit of discussion on which is better, fork or the round one. But so long as they're nice and snug on this end, should be no issues. And then these are the ferrules, all nice and neat, going in and out of a fuse board there. Speaking of fuse boards, this is, we saw this previously before, there is one as a prize today, is a mains fuse board. I'm putting this up separately because everything else hereafter is for low voltage, but I just wanted to stress that a mains fuse board is a totally different business to the low voltage fuse boards that would be used. So this can be used either for 120 or 240 volt. Each input is 5 amps for a total maximum of 10 amps. And then these are two examples of sort of a lower voltage fuse boards. So the top one is a hex fuse from Hanson Electronics, which is 3 30 amp inputs, breaking out to 6 15 amp outputs. The bottom left one is from Falcon, the home of the Falcon controller boards. F8 distro is one 30 amp input into 8 5 amp outputs. And you might notice a subtle difference there. It's actually got positive and negative wires are fused, whereas the hex fuse is only, depending on how you're wiring it, effectively could only be doing the positive side if you choose to do so. And both of those fuse boards will require fuses. And that's what they look like. The different colours represent a different amps of fuse that they require. The 101 guide has got a lot more detail on fusing requirements and links to calculators for voltage and amps and things like that you need. So, recommend checking that out. Controller now. So you've got your controller, but what do you do with it? You want to protect that investment. It's probably one of the most expensive things you've bought potentially, aside of the thousands and thousands of pixels. So you need to put it somewhere and keep it nice and safe in an enclosure. The things to consider are cable glands, so that all the cables can go in and out to the controller. If it's being mounted with a power supply, the box could get pretty hot. So it needs to be ventilated. You don't necessarily want it just sitting on the ground either. So you want to lift it up. So some examples. The top left one was one of my old DC boards that I used to use in the old Masters box with the PSU as well. Another example that I use, these are just 15 litre storage containers from Kmart, and I've got a power supply on the bottom one and my Falcon board on the top, and I cover them over with a large Coro handmade present to make it look more Christmassy and hide them away a bit more too. On the left there, Scamper had a bit of a command central setup. So I think that's an old electrical fuse box from memory with the power supply and a couple of controllers in it. And you'll notice the ventilation on the side there as well. The middle image there is the CG 1500, I think that's right. Is one of the more popular boxes I've seen used overseas. But ammo crates as well are starting to get a bit of a run as a enclosure for lights as well. So to get the cables in and out, to try and keep it waterproof and dustproof, cable glands up there on the top left. For ventilation of airflow, excuse me, a conduit elbow could be used. Or specific enclosure vents, like one next to the logo there. Depending on the size of the box and how much heat's going to be generated, natural airflow may not be sufficient, so you might want to chuck in an actual fan or two. One definitely to blow the hot air out, but one maybe to suck in the cooler air. And they'll run on 5 or 12 volts, those type of fans. So again, that's something else to consider that you might need to run from a PSU nearby. Mounting the actual controllers themselves, chuck them on some PCB feet, or one of those sort of sticky back type ones. Again, you might want a silicon in if for a more solid foundation. Different types of spacers. Even a plastic chopping board cut to the size of the base of the enclosure is enough to sort of mount some of these things too. But of course, some of these type of crates will have specific holes already pre-drilled, ready for you to mount things to. If they don't work out, you can get templates to put into the bottom of it as well to mount your items too. Onto cabling. So, cables, you'll need some data leads, you'll need power injection leads, you'll need 240 volt to power up your PSUs, you'll need some network cables, and you'll no doubt be creating your own cables for your specific needs or lengths and or repairs. The 101's got a really good section on cable types and goes in a lot of detail around what cables to use, taking into consideration voltage drops, calculating loads, wire gauge, etc. This is certainly not a be-all and end-all of what that is. This is certainly suggest you research on there to get that information, but some examples of cable types. The top two is 4 and 6 core security cable. Should be good for data only, but some people use it for power also and have no problems whatsoever, Daryl. If it ain't broken, it didn't burn down, then I'm not going to fix it. Figure 8 cable, speaker cable, can be good for power too, particularly if it's the thicker gauge stuff. Particularly going from PSUs to the fuse boards, where they probably have the handle sort of the biggest loads. 240 volt extension cable can also be good for power too. I'm not sure about data. I mean, it's cable, so I guess it can be used for that too. Get off my laptop, Daryl. Cat 5E or 6, I believe is only good for data. I don't know if anyone's been successful in actually getting power down it as well, but it's been known to be quite good for getting long data runs. So if your controller is one end of the house and the item that you've got going to is a lot further away, Cat 5 apparently is very good for getting that through. And if you're going to have power out in the yard, etc., you'll need to protect that too. So things like these kind of boxes which you can put in power boards, etc. You obviously need 240 volt extension leads to power those boards. This type 1 is just literally like an extension lead kind of protection as well. I think from a safety perspective though, I think most agree that the less amount of 240 that we have out in our yards, the better, regardless of whether people are sort of walking through or not. And when we're creating or repairing our cables, we'll need something to do that with, such as soldering iron. So a stock standard cheapy soldering iron might do all right, but given the amount of work it will probably put it through, it might burn out pretty quickly. So you might want to get something a bit more upmarket. I'm not saying these are the Rolls-Royce models, but these are just a couple of examples of something that has an adjustable temperature. So depending on the type of work you're doing, you might actually need to dial up or dial down the heat of the iron when you're soldering. There's also some 3-in-1 solutions where you've got the soldering iron heat gun attached to it as well. That's a solder pot there. So I've never seen one or used one before. Oh, really? Okay. Ah. Thank you for that tip. When they do work, though, the idea is that they keep the solder at a melted point. So if you're tinning a lot of wires and you've got a lot of things to connect, you literally can just keep dipping your wires in and it'll tin them pretty quickly for you. So when you're making your cables up or connecting your connectors, etc., you'll put on some heat shrink first before soldering anything. And the connectors, if they've got a weather seal connector, put that on first, then put on the heat shrink, then test it with a multimeter after you've done it. Because if it's wrong, do it and do it again. And then when it's right, then shrink the heat shrink. In that order.
When do you inject the silica?
I will cover that off later, but yeah, you can. Yeah, if it's for sealing, yeah, definitely before doing the heat gun. And even if you don't have a heat gun, a hairdryer, or even a lighter or a flame torch type thing, any type of sort of concentrated heat source will work on heat shrink. It's probably good to have a bit of a wiring guide too. We know that not always the colours for the wiring is going to be consistent with every single batch. Most of the time it is, but there's going to be the odd case where it won't be. So if you've got a standard for your display, kind of stick to it, yeah? That's literally my quick quickly drawn up one that I did a few years ago, and it's literally printed out and posted right above my workbench where I do all my repairs. And I look at it every single time that I'm at that workbench just to make triply sure when I connect them up. Yep.
And can I just make a suggestion when it comes to your pigtails and whatever? Your standard should be based on the pin, not the colour of the wire. 'Cause
yes.
The wire may change, the colour may change, and then you'll find that something didn't work and your lights don't work anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I've got there the pin, obviously what colour that wire is, but also what it does, right? So that, yeah, in the example that if you get a new batch of connectors and the wire colour has changed, you can still refer to that and go, I know that bottom pin is always going to be data for me, or whatever the case might be. And if you're doing a whole lot of repairs on cables and making up your own, you will need something like adjustable wire strippers, like pictured there. There's the exact ones that I've got, and they are a godsend. Daryl mentioned silicon before, so if you're putting pigtails onto the end of strip, for example, but you want to seal up that connection, excuse me, again, before sort of sealing it all up, put the heat shrink on. You've obviously tested that the wiring is correct. Put the heat shrink over and jam in some of that silicon, and then put the heat shrink on. And as it shrinks, it'll kind of squirt out the end, so that's fine. At least you know that you've kind of filled that section there, and then let it dry. That neutral cure silicon is probably the better one, purely because if it does get into contact with any wiring, it's not going to necessarily corrode it away. So you've got all your wires and the lights and everything. Now you need to kind of put it all together. So how are you going to do that? Is it going to be through a PC or a Mac, I guess, running software such as Enclosure? Or is it going to be one of the microcomputers that we've sort of touched on before, Raspberry Pi or a BeagleBone Black? Both can run the software of Falcon Pi Player. But there's other things to consider with all this setup as well. So looking at these microcontrollers, that's kind of what they look like, but you'll need some other things as well. They need power, for example. They don't work on their own, so they both run on 5 volts from a PSU, which you'll need to supply. The Pi will have I think it's USB-C connection from memory. So even a phone charger could be used as its power source, making sure, of course, that it's got the right amount of amps to power it. These things can be a bit finicky if they haven't got the right amount of amps coming through to them. You'll also need a micro SD card or the software to be loaded on, or the operating system. And you'll need an external USB key to store all your sequences and media on as well. These items have been known to not have the best audio quality if you're doing an audio link to audio display. So something like that Smart Alex sells, the USB sound card dongle, can plug straight into one of the USB ports available on the device, and that becomes your line out to go to your speakers or your stereo, etc. So for networking, again, I'm not an expert, but I'll try and cover this at top level as much as I can. Do you want it to be separate to your home network or part of it? And one of those questions that it brings up is, do you want to broadcast your show in multicast versus unicast? And it's kind of the Ford Holden question all over, so I'm not going to necessarily get involved with that, but there are pros and cons to both, is all I'm saying. So do a bit more research. Again, these are things that are covered off in the 101 fairly extensively. Do you want to have wireless access to the show? Do you want the show to be set up permanently infrastructure, or do you just put it up in November and tear it down in January? So you've got your PC or your laptop or your Falcon playing device, a Pi in this example. You'll need it connected to a network switch, possibly, particularly if you're going to have multiple connections to multiple controllers, I should say. And you'll need the network cables to go from that switch to those controllers. And in this example, if you've got DMX lights as well, you'll need a connection from In this example, the Falcon has got is a E131 to DMX bridge, so you want to come out of the DMX side of the board to your DMX controller as well. If that was a separate network, that's how you would necessarily sort of, bigger picture, set it up. The only difference if you want it to be joined into your existing home network is you take out the computer and you plug the network switch into your existing home network, which will have your existing PCs, laptops, and possibly even a Pi player housed somewhere else. You can still run it through that way. The point I'm getting to here is you still need to connect all these things, and this is other equipment and expenses that you'll need to consider when building the show. Miscellaneous stuff. So for those that are doing audio synced displays, you'll need things like an FM transmitter to get that sound from your show to your viewers' car stereos, or you might want to put some speakers out the front so walkers by can hear it. You may even want a small little audio mixer, very similar to the one that Ryan's running today. To be able to adjust multiple levels, you might want to put a microphone in and announce that Santa's coming to visit, or you've got the choir coming in, things like that. And then we'll wrap up with a few extra bits and pieces that you might need to consider. So from the audio perspective, if you are going to use a mixer, it might need power. There are examples, and I think the one we're using today is USB powered one. Yep. So again, you can just use USB power if it's running off a computer or a laptop, etc. You will need speakers, outdoor ones preferably, that can survive in the weather, and speaker cable to get to it, and obviously the transmitter itself to get the audio from your computer or your player into the radios. Rounding out some miscellaneous bits and pieces. So cutters of any way, shape or form description, you'll most definitely want to be cutting something, so make sure you've got a good steady knife. If you're using silicon, you'll need a silicon gun. If you're doing lots of soldering and detailed work, something like a magnifying setup with a light, etc. will help. Those helping hands kind of things are also very handy as well. Chances are you'll need to hold two bits of wires together and the soldering iron and be on the phone and all the rest of it, so that definitely comes in handy. You might want to use some electrical tape to help identify some of your cables. Of course, you can always colour code your cables. Heat gun, so if you're doing corro kind of work or some sort of quick repairs, a heat gun, or glue gun, sorry, is very handy to put corro things together. And what does a glue gun need? Glue sticks, you get the idea. Hole punching, so if you're making your own custom corro creations that you want to punch holes through, which Ryan has his example of again, hole punch is one way to do it. Some people might have the drill press, just pump them through that way. Tent pegs is something that's used in my yard to keep a lot of my things from blowing away. So the videos that we were showing earlier, the arches are conduit feet, sort of T feet. I just drilled a little hole in the bottom of those feet and just jammed in a couple of tent pegs. They didn't move the entire season. Same with my corro stars and corro bits and pieces, and on the front lawn, just build in some tabs on them or even glue them on, and just using tent pegs just to hold them in place so they don't blow away. And some people may use 240 volt timers to actually turn on their shows to make it like truly self-automated. Myself, as an example, my Raspberry, I run my show off a Raspberry Pi through a network switch. The Pi and the switch are constantly powered. Everything else turns on with 2 or 3 of these type timers, and they will turn on the power supplies for the lights and the FM transmitter as well, so it's not transmitting to the air all day.
I was going to mention, for cutting corro, don't bother buying a corro cutting knife. Go into Bunnings and buy a carpet hook knife that goes in normally Stanley, and you find the hook goes on one side of the little square slot, and just run it straight down, give it a straight line every time.
Oh, great.
They work really well. And
that's
$5 for 10 of them or something.
Oh, great. I just use a Stanley knife, and yeah, it's like, don't go through the second core. Like,
no.
I mean, I've gotten good at it now because I've got so much of the crap on the display. But yeah, I use a lot of my Coros 3mm, and I haven't been able to find a 3mm cutter for some reason. I've got a 5mm one, but it doesn't. You know, I hardly got any 5mm Coros. So
Yeah, the hook cutters work very well.
oh, that's a great idea. Thank you.
Is there anywhere else to buy the Coro from apart from Bunnings?
Bunnings is a bit of a last effort because it is a bit expensive. But again, like most things at Bunnings, you're paying for the convenience of it being there, right? That said, I haven't actually seen the listings online for Coro for them for a little while, so I don't even know if they're still stocking it or arranging it anymore. But a lot of sign places, a quick Google search, you'll be able to find some places that will sell it by individual sheets or packs of 5 sheets, 10 sheets, or maybe even by a pallet's worth sort of thing. I initially, most of my designs from a couple of years ago was just me constantly running up to Bunnings every couple of weekends and buying new sheets. But I thought, I'm buying so much of this, it's expensive, surely there's a cheaper way. And I found a place that was nearby, not too far away from where I live, down in Melbourne. And they only sold it in, I think it was larger packs. It wasn't a full pallet, but it was kind of like a quarter of a pallet of the thing. So I just chucked a thread up and said if anyone in South East suburbs wants to go halvies or thirds or whatever in some sheets. And we did that. They were the bigger sheets too. So it was actually Craig who was meant to be here today. So we just spent 10 minutes just going through and just cutting them all in half and just divvied them all up. So now I've got a bit of a supply.
With the Raspberry Pis, I've got the little micro USB plugs. Goes down to a DC socket, so it's easier for people to power them.
Oh, okay, yeah, cool. Yeah. One thing I didn't cover off, which is slightly off topic to consumables, but it's the Pis and the BBBs have capes to go on top of them to control lights and panels and stuff as well. And a lot of the time, those capes actually have power inputs on them. So if you're connecting that, then you can power the Pi through there as well. Don't necessarily need to do it separately.